Hi, everybody. I'm Barry Silverman, Vice President of Marketing and Brand at Ultrafabrics, and welcome to Strategic Multisensory Design for Neurodiverse Users. Our event explores how to bring multiple visual, tactical, auditory, and olfactory design elements together in a sensory-rich environment and aid in the navigation of greater well-being for users who are neurodiverse and neurodegenerative. At Ultrafabrics, we think about comfort, and that's a big part of who we are and why this is so relevant to this topic. And we've partnered with Pantone to bring you this webinar because both of us as brands desire to bring critical thinkers together to talk about some of the most important issues that are affecting the world of design. This particular issue is extremely contemporary, very important, and we're going to explore some practical use cases that really bring this to life and give a lot of important information. What's also important to understand is that the future of work, we believe, is about neurodiversity. And the question we have for you is, are you ready for it? It's not really a challenge to overcome. It's actually a strength to harness. And here's why. Because some data shows us that 29% of individuals who are neurodivergent are not employed. Yet, neurodivergent teams are said to be 30% more productive. And actually, those are very conservative numbers. Some people think that percentage is much higher. So workplaces are often designed or not designed to support neurodivergent individuals. And that really is the question for us. Do we have the right accommodations and understanding to support this very new and very important trend and movement and issue that is affecting the design world today? And so we've assembled a panel of experts, people who have been thinking about this, working in the field, and really have a lot to contribute. We have Magda Mostafa as a founding partner and principal of StudioTM, a design consultancy based in Dubai. Magda Mostafa is a specialist in autism and neuroinclusive design, as well as a professor of design at the American University in Cairo. She is the author of Aspects Design Index, the world's first research-based design framework for autism. And we have Kay Sargent. Kay is a practicing licensed and certified interior designer with 40 years of experience. Kay is the director of thought leadership interiors for HOK, a global architectural and design firm, and the author of the forthcoming book, Designing Neuroinclusive Workspaces, Advancing Sensory Processing and Cognitive Well-Being in the Built Environment. And finally, we have Jane Boddy. Jane Boddy is a global trend forecaster who specializes in color. Starting her career over 20 years ago, originally in fashion, she now works with businesses across the global markets to include interior, automotive, product design, as well as hair and beauty products to help companies predict colors that consumers will be buying in the future. We'll be starting today's webinar with a posthumous contribution written by Steve Silverman. Steve is a noted science writer and historian, and he is a widely respected voice in the area of neuroinclusivity. He's also the author of the best-selling book, Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity. His writing was published in Wired, the New York Times, and the New Yorker. Among other publications, he also spoke about the history of autism in institutions and events around the world. Steve was planning to participate in this webinar before his untimely passing in August of 2024. In tribute, we have included the short piece he wrote for this event, entitled Designing a World for All Kinds of Minds, read here by another voice. Steve's thoughtful essay often frames conversation today for some broader context on neurodiversity and its increasing relevance in culture.
We're living at a very exciting time in history. Our society is in the process of a major transformation in its understanding of cognitive differences like autism, dyslexia, and ADHD. We're evolving from viewing these conditions solely through a medical lens, seeing people who have these diagnoses merely as checklists of deficits and dysfunctions, to viewing these conditions as alternate styles of learning and being, with their own distinctive strengths, gifts, and positive attributes, as well as profound challenges. These strengths offer potential boons to our communities, schools, and workplaces, but only if we're able to provide the appropriate accommodations, supports, methods of training, research, and design. In other words, we're moving from viewing people with these conditions as failed versions of normal to, as the autistic industrial designer Temple Grandin says, different, not less. The word neurodiverse may be relatively new and unfamiliar to some of you, though I guarantee you'll be hearing it a lot in the coming years, because neurodivergent people comprise one of the largest minorities on the planet, representing an estimated 15 to 20% of the global population. So, what does the word neurodiversity mean, and where did it come from? One way to understand the concept of neurodiversity is to think in terms of human operating systems, instead of diagnostic labels like dyslexia and ADHD. Just because a computer is not running Windows doesn't mean that it's broken. Not all the features of atypical human operating systems are bugs. For example, people diagnosed with dyslexia are often good at recognizing patterns, seeing the big picture, and telling stories that can clarify that big picture for their colleagues. Meanwhile, by autistic standards, the so-called normal brain is easily distractible, obsessively social, and suffers from a deficit of attention to detail and routine. Thus, people on the spectrum experience the neurotypical world as relentlessly unpredictable and chaotic, perpetually turned up too loud, and full of people who have little respect for sincerity and personal space. That's a very different view of the human mind than the one that prevailed through most of the 20th century. In the old view, there was only one model of the healthy mind, the so-called normal or neurotypical model, the Windows operating system. If your own experience of the world varied significantly from that model, if you felt you could hear certain colors, for example, or if you work better by focusing intensely on a project in solitude rather than by being a good team player, you could be judged by your teachers, your employer, or the psychiatric establishment to be neurotic at best and unwell at worst. Now, we understand that hidden behind these narrow-minded judgments and labels is something amazing that is crucial to the success of our society at every level. The magnificent diversity of human cognitive styles, with each individual bringing to the table their own unique set of gifts, skills, aptitudes and challenges, and ways of experiencing their own senses in the world. We've learned that by building neuro-inclusive environments and organizations, teams of people who think differently from one another can see and solve problems more efficiently and creatively than homogeneous groups of neurotypicals. Industrial designer Temple Grandin, who I mentioned earlier, says she became a leader in her field not in spite of her autism, but because of it. She describes designing a prototype of a machine and setting it running in her head. And a week later, she would check it to see where the points of wear were. So how did we come to this inflection point? The concept of neurodiversity emerged from one of the first online communities, an email list run by an autistic programmer called Independent Living on the Autism Spectrum. One of the list participants, an anthropology student named Judy Singer, read a book called Disability, Whose Handicap? By Anne Shearer, a Jungian analyst who probed the ways that people with physical and cognitive differences are systematically disabled, excluded, and even demonized by society. Shearer observed just how handicapping the limitations of disability become depends either on how well the environment is adapted to the range of people who use it, or on the opportunities they have had to learn to cope with it, or both. Many of the list members were women, and they were frustrated by the fact that all of the words used to describe the ways their minds worked were pathologizing, a litany of deficits and dysfunctions. So they coined the word neurodiversity to celebrate the fact that diversity of neurology may turn out to be as important to human communities as biodiversity is to the resilience of rainforests. They hoped that the concept of honoring neurodiversity would spread through the disability rights community as a rallying cry, as phrases like "Black is beautiful," "Gay is good," and "Sisterhood is powerful" had helped mobilize mass movements in the 1960s and 1970s. In the past 20 years, the United States has spent billions of dollars hunting for possible causes of conditions like autism and ADHD in the human genome. But imagine if society had put off the issue of civil rights until the genetics of race were sorted out, delayed the legalization of gay marriage until the causes of homosexuality had been nailed down, or denied wheelchair users access to public buildings while insisting, someday, with the help of science, everyone will walk. Designing neuro-inclusive environments to ensure that everyone is given the best chance of success is not beyond our capabilities as a society, as the exciting presentations you are about to hear make clear. As we drive forward together into the 21st century, which will present challenges on a global scale that we couldn't have foreseen, we need to design spaces where the energy and creativity of people with many different kinds of minds working together can thrive and spark. All of us are helping to build a world in which the frontiers of innovation, connection, and engagement are open to everyone. And conversations like the one we're having today bring us ever closer to our goal.
Now let's narrow the lens to look at a designer bringing research into reality and some practical approaches to the built environment that make neuro-inclusive spaces possible. I'm going to turn it over to Magda.
Thanks, Barry. So I want to start by just sharing that I really believe that when we design for autism, we design for everyone. And I'll share with you why I hold this belief and also maybe show you some practical examples of how we can achieve this goal. But before we start, just a little timeline history. So I've been working in the neuroinclusive and autism design space for over 20 years now. And my interest really began as the classic necessity is the mother of invention. In 2002, I was asked to design one of the Middle East's first autism schools and realized very quickly that there were really no guidelines that I could refer to. And I remember reaching out to the International Building Council and other agencies that were looking at accessibility at the time and asking them if they knew of any codes or best practices. And I still have a letter from one of them back saying that they do not have, nor do they know of, any code standards or best practices for designing for autism. So we, along with the school, the parents, and the students, decided to create them. And working closely with the school with on-site design experimentation, we gathered data through behavioral mapping and observation. And after multiple iterations over almost a decade of time, in 2014, we published the Autism Aspects Design Index, which is a set of 7 principles that help inform spatial decisions in support of the autistic experience. And we were later approached in 2020 by the autism self-advocacy group As I Am in Ireland to help take that expertise from the K-12 school space to the higher education context. And we developed the world's first autism-friendly university design guide. And throughout the process of developing the guide, we worked really closely with autism advocates, autistic students, neurodivergent staff and faculty, as well as autistic adults from the community. And the entire process was completely autism voice informed and also peer reviewed by the autistic higher education community, which was really central and important to our work to make sure that it included and was authored by the autistic voice. So the result was an expansion of the original 7 principles of aspects to include guidance on things like color, lighting, materiality, furnishing, wayfinding and navigation, programming, operation, and so on, to bring the concept of Aspects 2.0 to a total of 15 criteria. And I'll illustrate what those are. But before I do that, I just wanted to share that Aspects has now been presented by As I Am to the Irish Parliament for consideration as a basis for autism-friendly design legislation across Ireland and other EU countries, hopefully. And I continue to work with As I Am to scale that up and replicate the kinds of things that we did across the globe. And Aspects currently informs architecture in 5 different continents. But I want to dive into really explain what these 15 principles are. And to do that, I'll do it through a case study, an autism hospital in the US that I recently consulted on with SFS architects and BSA life structures. So the 15 principles, in addition, are acoustics, spatial sequencing, escape, compartmentalization, transition, sensory zoning, safety in the original version, and expanded out in 2.0 to include other concepts of color, lighting, material, furniture, and so on. So just thinking through the autism-friendly hospital, I just want to start with a little bit of statistics to frame the problem. So research shows us that individuals on the spectrum are less healthy and have shorter lifespans than their typical neurotypical counterparts for no clinical reason that has anything to do with their autism. And research indicates that of the top 3 contributing factors, the built environment in healthcare spaces presents a significant barrier to that access and contributes to these really shocking health statistics. And autistic doctors and parents of autistic patients who have implemented aspects-informed design have even shared with me that they feel that aspects architecture can help save the lives of individuals by getting them into the hospital spaces where they need that care. So the process of designing this healthcare and research facility for autism really began with the planning. And as architects were trained to zone spaces almost solely through utility and function, but asked us to layer on the sensory quality. So we look at spaces in their organization into low stimulation and high stimulation spaces, building in a lot of transition in between. We also think about the narrative of how individuals, particularly patients, move through these spaces. And the concept of spatial sequencing requires us to organize these proximities and tell the story and allow the space to flow and the sensospatial narrative of the hospital experience to mirror what a day in the life of a patient would look like as they move through their care journey in the hospital, to make sure that it's predictable and safe and comfortable as possible for them. And operationally, for efficiency reasons, Aspects also requires us to calculate what we call operational capital as an asset. So in typologies like hospitals and schools where experiences are really scheduled, it's actually time in autism-friendly spaces that is our asset, not the square footage alone. So Aspects concepts like spatial sequencing, transition, sensory zoning, although we express them as these discrete concepts, they're actually interdependent and really work best when they are integrated together. So this is illustrated here in the wayfinding concept of the hospital that begins from the moment of arrival at the parking lot, where we have this colored pathway, which we call the stream, which captures the arrival of the patient and gives them a delineation to follow using color and materiality as they move through the hospital. And the stream continues to the reception, which is signposted with this beautiful acoustic ceiling mounting installation that landmarks the check-in experience. And then it leads to a color-coded graphic navigation panel based on which patients can navigate using both color and graphic language. And at the entry point, we've allocated 2 sensory perches that allows patients to reduce their anxiety so that they can observe and predict and plan the hospital experiences they move through. And then additional concepts like escape, transition, and compartmentalization continue through the entire hospital flow to allow for moments of this kind of sensory regulation and retreat to reduce anxiety. And most recently, we've gone back and tested these strategies for neurodivergent and neurotypical patients and participants and found a carryover across the 2 populations that was really interesting. And like the Autism Friendly University project, it was entirely autism voice informed, which is really key to the concept of my work, which began with autism as an object or a subject of study, but now has moved towards this notion of autism as an agent, autism as an expert, and autism as an author. And to a place where I think that we bring value when we design not only for autism, but with autism and by autism. Thank you.
Thank you, Magda. Really, really, really interesting. Just a couple questions to keep us going. I'm really fascinated with Aspects, and I'm sure that there's a lot more that you could have shared with us. But I was wondering, for our design community, can you talk a little bit about when Aspects should be integrated into the design process if you're starting a new project? So is there a point in time, or is there, a place that you really begin to think about utilizing that tool more seriously?
I mean, I think there are milestones throughout the project, but as a general rule, the earlier we begin the conversation, the better. As early as planning what services, what programming elements you're bringing into the space, bringing into the project, making sure that you allocate and safeguard footprint in your project for that kind of sensory infrastructure that's so key to making these spaces accessible. And that really happens at early stages of even citing a project, estimating budgets for high level early on for planning purposes. But the earlier, always the better. And then although aspects as a framework, it really operates on so many different levels. So it may begin at the high level of planning on services and program and what the building will deliver, all the way to deciding on what material the doorknob is going to be or what color we're going to paint the walls. So at each level, there's a deeper understanding, and at each milestone throughout the design process. But I always say the earlier the better, and the longer we remain in conversation up to even post-occupancy on operationally how a building can be operated to best utilize that sensory infrastructure. I think that's really the key to using and utilizing aspects most effectively.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. One of the things I was really intrigued with in your presentation was this depiction of lifespan with neurodivergent individuals. And it brought up the question to me about the concern for well-being, and so clearly when you're designing for a hospital, the main objective is well-being, right? Or the health of, the people and your staff and your patients. I'm curious what you have found in your work relative to just enterprise either being more concerned about well-being or not, or are you seeing that change relative to, a company wanting the health of their employees to be really considered a factor before the new design process starts?
I mean, absolutely. I think quality of life is so important, but I think the earlier part of your question about lifespan, what's really interesting is I almost feel that the body of work that I've engaged in has grown up with the awareness of that cohort of individuals. If you remember around the 2002s, there were all these headlines about the autism epidemic and the explosion of autism across the United States. And we know now that that wasn't really an increase in autism, it was just an increase in understanding what autism is and diagnostic tools that were more effective and more precise. So that 2002 cohort has kind of grown up with the work. So what began as early intervention, K-12 work, became higher education, became workplace environment, became hospitals as autistic adults become more independent and responsible for their own health care, and as a result may not have the support of a family or a parent or a caregiver. That problem has been really highlighted. And I'm anticipating in the very near future, and it's already happening, thinking about assisted living and senior communities and so on. So really being engaged in the built environment across the lifespan of individuals, I think is really critical. But when it comes to quality of life, and I'll quote here my friend Chris Downey, who always talks about not only the utilitarian lens of universal design, it's not only about successfully getting a body into space, but this concept of universal delight. Everyone should have the equal right to be happy, and feel a sense of belonging, a sense of community. And interestingly, that may look a little different for a neurodivergent mind than it does for a neurotypical mind. It may not be large social gatherings. It may not be very verbal, active behavior, but that doesn't mean that an individual isn't enjoying or part of a communal act or part of a workplace environment. So the metrics that we're looking at are very normative. So what we think we're seeing as sense of belonging or quality of life may look different for different folks. And we need to understand that, and we need to understand how we can support it. But I think talking to clients about it just not being a utilitarian thing of getting a body into a space, but making sure that they are not only productive, but they are happy as they're being productive.
Thank you, Magda. Next, we'll learn about some sensory-specific strategies for designing more neuro-inclusive workplaces that can promote comfort and productivity for all users. So I'm going to turn it over to Kay Sargent.
Thank you, Barry. So what we know is that 1 in 5 people are considered to be neurodivergent. And what's interesting is when we started our research about 8 years ago, that number was 1 in 8. Then it went to 1 in 7, 1 in 6, and today it stands at 1 in 5. But we still think that that's actually a conservative estimate of the number of people that are actually neurodivergent. And the interesting thing is that fewer than 50% of the people that are neurodiverse even know that they are, because so many people in the older generation went undiagnosed for such a long time. But if you are neurodivergent, you are in great company, because there are many people who are highly creative, innovative, entrepreneurs, writers, artists, who are outside of the box thinkers and who have really kind of harnessed that as almost a superpower for themselves. So I want to start by talking a little bit about sensory thresholds. So people that respond to stimulation in the built environment in kind of a predictable way, we're going to call those kind of neurotypical. They kind of follow that middle of that pot. But we also then on that spectrum have individuals that are hypersensitive, meaning they can't take too much stimulation. They might need things to be more ordered. They might not be able to handle too much noise, might need a little bit more personal space. But on the other side of the spectrum, we have people that are hyposensitive. And people that are hyposensitive actually need more stimulation. They might need to listen to music. They might need to physically move or fidget and engage with that space. They might need richer environments to be in. So our challenge is to create environments that accommodate people across this entire spectrum of sensory thresholds. And what we know is that sensory distractions, like smells, visual clutter, sounds, those lead to cognitive distractions, the loss of focus and discomfort. And that then leads to a loss of engagement and or productivity. It can also lead to presenteeism, poor recall, stress, burnout, dissatisfaction. Those are all the things that we're trying to avoid in the workplace today. But they all truly have a root cause in sensory distractions. And one blogger once said that autistic people are canaries in the coal mine. Our needs aren't actually different from typical people. They're just more intense and more specific. And what we find is that no one is immune to sensory stimulation in the built environment. Everyone has some reaction. But what might be annoying or agitating to someone who's defined as neurotypical can be debilitating to someone that is neurodivergent. And those challenges that we know are whether it's sound, temperature, and lighting. These tend to be the prevalent offenders in the spaces. And there's two numbers under each one of these. The first will tell you 100% neurodivergent population and how they responded and identified what the challenges were. And the bucket underneath that is for a mixed neurotype, kind of what you would find in a typical office environment. And what we found is that what's bothering individuals that are neurodivergent are the same things that are bothering neurotypicals, a mixed neurotype, except potentially maybe to a lesser degree. So again, sound and temperature tend to be the biggest issues that people are facing. The next thing really is how many people are in the space and how close you are to those individuals in the space. We also know that enclosure can impact individuals. And contrary to popular belief that open plan is the worst offender, we also found that there are many people, in fact, more individuals are bothered by being in confined or enclosed space. But if we're designing spaces in the open, they have to be designed well to give people options and choices so that they can really be successful. And we also then know that pattern, color, and texture are also impacting people. Now, you'll notice that that appears to be to a lesser degree. But our theory on this is that those tend to be less prevalently offensive in the built environment. And so therefore people didn't notice it as being as much of a problem. But if you were to walk into a room that had a bright red color, crazy pattern and texture on the wall, you would probably have an immediate reaction to that. It's just that most spaces tend to be not designed to that extreme. And so in our research, what we found is there are some top strategies that continually come up to the top of the list. Having an option about where to sit so you can kind of choose your sensory experience might be important for some individuals. Others might need to move. Some might need a dedicated space, especially those that are OCD. Access to natural daylight, access to quiet rooms, the ability to adjust the lighting levels, ergonomic furniture, reducing visual clutter. All of those things are important and big strategies as far as how do we really start to address the built environment. Because we know that when you design for the extreme, you benefit the mean, meaning everyone can benefit. Just like a curb cut doesn't just help individuals in a wheelchair, it also helps people with suitcases, strollers. It helps all of us. And the other thing that's really important is we think about the spatial sequencing and the modalities of work. So from our research, we know that there are 6 types of things that people are doing: concentrate, contemplate, create, that communal work in an open area together, congregating, and social. And we want to be able to create a hyper and a hypo-sensitive version of both of those. But then we also have to be really careful about how we sequence that. If we're taking those busy spaces and plopping it right down in the middle where people are trying to focus or concentrate, then we've sabotaged both of those activities and the individuals that are trying to do that. So we need to be very strategic about how we're designing spaces today. And we've created a whole checklist of what we need to be focused on, but we're visual. So I'll just give you kind of one example for that concentrate. For someone that is hyposensitive, they need more stimulation. They may not want to be in a confined space, but they might want to be able to move, fidget, and maybe just be off to the side so that they can signal to people they're doing something solo. But for people that are hypersensitive, they might want to be in a space where they can close a door, block their visual stimulation, control the lighting, etc. Option, choice, and variety are some of the most important principles that really can help us address the variety of things that we're seeing today. Color has a huge impact on that. We're going to get into that a little bit more. But they can either be very calming, they can be refreshing, they can be stimulating. And if you park on level 2 and there's a pink graphic, more people will remember that they parked on the pink floor than the second floor. So it can really help with grounding individuals, wayfinding, etc. So just some really quick examples of here's a space that used to be a closed-in conference room with the largest rectangular table they could shove into the room. But we opened it up a little bit so it wasn't so boxed in, but it's still a defined space. You now have access to that natural daylight. You have room that people can move and fidget, or maybe sit with their back against the wall so they feel a little bit more protected. The colors bring in a biophilic element, and the ceiling is a perforated metal that emulates walking under a canopy of trees in the forest. So it's a much softer approach that accommodates that variety that we might have. And this is an example of creating zones within a space to accommodate the various needs of individuals. We also embrace this notion of prospect and refuge, giving people the clear ability to see what's coming, what's ahead of them, so they can kind of understand if they're in danger, helps address their psychological safety, but also gives them an out, another area where they can pop off to the side if they don't want to encounter somebody that they're walking towards. And of course, this is another great example of introducing those elements of biophilia and those natural colors and that natural palette. And then here's a great example of a space where we've brought the inside out, lots of access to natural daylight, but it's again a space that defines that zone within a zone. So on the right side, you might have a space that's more calm, more controlled, more clarity. But then on the left side, there's a little bit more visual interest for people that need that additional stimulation, lots of different settings that people can find the sensory experience that meets their need. Because we are no longer just designing environments. We are really designing the entire experience. And we need to make sure that that's a neuro-inclusive one and that it's suited for everyone's sensory thresholds.
Thank you, Kay. That was really interesting, very fascinating, and smart, thoughtful work. One of the questions that came to my mind as you were speaking was that it would seem to me that this field of designing for neurodiversity is relatively new. Not sure exactly how long it's been around in terms of at least being more in the design eye or in our contemporary mind share. I am curious if, in fact, your company has studied at all the actual impact on productivity, because clearly this is being done for a reason, right? Companies need to feel as though their design-built spaces are contributing to the level of comfort their employees have or the level of productivity they might deliver. Have you looked at yet any data or information, anecdotal or others, in terms of how this actually impacts business with the appropriate design?
Yeah, so it's fascinating that you say that because Magda and I would probably both say that this topic has actually been around for a long time, but it hasn't really gotten the attention of people up until more recently. Even, 8 years ago when we started talking about this, most people did not understand what it was that we were talking about. And we did start to do some research and some studies on the productivity right when COVID hit. and people weren't in the office, so it was difficult. But I will say that since then, we have done multiple projects that we've incorporated these principles, and we have just finished, I think, our 6th research initiative where we studied before people were in a space that wasn't designed, what it was like when they were at home, and then in a space that was specifically designed. And we have qualitative and quantitative measurements, including biometrics, that we're going to be releasing in the near future that kind of just shows how we're doing that. When it comes to productivity, that's a challenge, because how do you measure productivity, right? And for knowledge workers, it can be very different than it can in a call center. But one of the things that we're hoping to do is to do it in an environment like a call center where it is more predictable and you can measure that productivity a little bit easier. So still to come on that.
So one other question came to mind. A lot of what you spoke about was the interactivity between these individuals and the actual built environment itself. So the things on the wall, the colors, the textures, the environment, the lighting, and things like that. A lot of design these days is also focused on creating settings that encourage collaboration with other people, large settings where you can, find yourself either alone or with large groups of people or small groups of people. I'm curious if there's been any thinking about this topic and the impact it might have with neurodivergency and the collaboration idea. Is it good? Is it better? Is it bad? What has your firm found?
Yeah, so we've done actually a lot of research, and this is where our research on workplace and neurodiversity collide together. And what we know is that the majority of conference rooms out there basically are the largest rectangular table you can shove into a room with the maximum number of chairs and really don't give anybody any options and choices. And so if we can give a little bit more generosity, if we can design these spaces to be more tailored to the purpose at hand. For instance, if you're doing innovation work, you don't need a big table in the middle of the room. You might need lots of wall space. And giving people the option to maybe sit back a little bit, have a little bit more space between that, or even people that can't sit for extended period of times, allowing them to stand. And then for all those people that need to fidget, right, give them a wall space where they can write or take notes during a meeting or visually put up what they're hearing so they can process it. We can also use technology to record meetings so they can listen to it later. But sometimes technology isn't our friend. So there's a lot of individuals that are autistic that have a very difficult time with direct eye contact. And when you're on a call like this and you've got multiple eyes on you, it can be a little intimidating and overwhelming. So understand that there are some people that if they're not directly staring into the camera, or they might be looking off, or they might not want to have their camera on, there might be a really good reason for that, and not just assume that everybody's being rude by not doing that, right? I think when we experience behavior that is different from our own, we need to not just assume that it's wrong, but that there might be something else to it, and we need to be able to accommodate different people and how they can express themselves.
Thank you, Kay. That was really terrific. Appreciate your thoughts and contribution on that. Finally, we'll hear about using color as a critical sensory tool for managing stimulation levels and fostering emotional well-being in spatial environments. So I'm going to hand it over to Jane Boddy. So Jane, it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. So really excited to be a part of this conversation today. And I've been learning so much from the experts on the panel, but I'm going to come to you today from, how myself in my practice and myself and the team at Pantone have been observing, how colour and basically its application can have a huge impact on those with a heightened sensory perception. So one really key thing to mention here is when we think about colour, we always kind of imagine colour on its own, like, we talk about red or we talk about yellow, but actually what's really important, what I've kind of put together in this presentation, is exactly how kind of colour actually does come together, and how when colours interact with each other, you do actually get, even more effects from the colours. So here we've got what I would describe as a sort of level of high saturation, extreme brights. So here we've got like a really intense red, a heavily saturated orchid tone, a sort of sharp neon, and a very intense yellow. And individually these colours have got a really sort of strong impact. But if we kind of put them together, the effect is even more intense. So what I've done for this presentation is create some sort of interior situations using AI. So here I've created what I would consider to be sort of a high impact environment from a color perspective, which, I would sort of look at this and think, oh, it's really cool. I've got these amazing colors, but actually to sort of spend a long time in this space would be really sort of intrusive to everyone, basically, not just the neurodiverse. So what I've focused on here is creating some mini palettes and interiors, which are basically all about inclusive color. So that's palettes which are great for everyone and create a less intrusive space. So as we've seen in some of the earlier presentations, sort of the blues and the greens are very soothing. These sort of colors come from nature, and they're very sort of grounding, non-intrusive. They sit in the background. And what I've done here is I've kind of looked at colors which also feel like they have quite a natural feel to them. They're a little bit more earthy, a little bit more muted. The olive green that we've got here feels very sort of earthy and grounding. The green is very soft. So from a design perspective, you can imagine sort of sitting in this environment for a long time. You wouldn't sort of feel like you're being, the colors were dominating the space. You'd feel like the colors were kind of like, keeping you calm, keeping you relaxed. So another example. Another sort of key color area, which we've been talking about a lot in the world of color that is very soothing, is the neutrals. These colors have been sort of very much trending in the world of fashion. We've had the whole quiet luxury era, and we've very much been talking in the world of color about how these colors actually do kind of soothe, harmonize, kind of comfort you. So from a design perspective, here we've got a very sort of big cavernous space, which could feel a bit hard and aggressive. But when we've got these sort of soft, muted browns in the space, it tends to sort of ground the environment and, make the space feel less aggressive. Obviously, the use of plants and biophilic design here make a big difference as well. Also, from a color perspective here, when you look at these sort of two colors on the right, these colors are very sort of warming. So when we're looking at color, we also kind of, we're not just sort of picking any old brown. We're really sort of considering what's really important about the brown. Well, the most important thing about the browns for this space is that very sort of, very warm. They have kind of pink undertones. On the left side, we've got slightly more sort of concrete levels of sort of neutral, a grey and this sort of beige tone. It's called doe skin. These two colours, again, it could be a little bit hard, being a bit more on the grey spectrum, but here we've kind of made sure these colours have a level of pink within them. So, it's the finer details in colour that's really important when selecting colours. Here we've got a very sort of, concrete led room, but when we sort of place this really beautiful camel tone into the space, it immediately feels a lot softer and much more of a sort of kinder place to sit in. So what's really important as well is when we're kind of thinking about how colour affects us, is to also, make sure we're kind of considering spaces that have a bit more of an upbeat, bit more of a sort of fun feel to them as well. We can create fun effects with the greens and the neutrals for sure, but, it's really great to experiment with sort of more fashion-led colours. So pastel tones, have been trending very much so in interior design. Pink has been very popular, and we've kind of seen that move over to the lilacs. And obviously, we've had Pantone Colour of the Year Peach Fuzz, which is a colour which is very much focused on, the sensory side of things. So here, we've got a muted range of pastels. So these are not kind of hard candy pastels. It's not harsh pink. It's not a, aggressive lilac. I've kind of looked at colours here, which are kind of like a slightly more greyed off tone to them. So if you go back to look at the palette itself, you can see that the pastel tones in this palette, they're not sugary sweet. They're not softer and muted. Therefore, a lot less sort of hard on the eyes. And when these colours join forces and come together, the actual environment itself becomes a lot more soft and sensual. So another really key point here is okay, so we want to, ensure that spaces, environments, inclusive to everyone. But at the same time, we're also really keen to ensure that we're kind of, tackling trends as well. We've seen orange be a really big trend in interior design, but orange can be quite an overwhelming colour, especially if there's sort of large amounts of it in a space. So kind of put a suggested palette here together of kind of feel-good citrus tones. So when you look at these sort of level of colours, I love this combination here. It makes me think of like a soft sunrise. But I've captured the spirit of orange in these colours, but actually they're a lot more soft and muted than a classic kind of bright orange tone. So it's about capturing the essence of the orange, but doing it in a way that's a lot softer and more soothing. So in this space here, we've kind of, we've got some of the yellow there as a sort of dominant colour, but it's a softer yellow, and we've got the kumquat in the background. Here we've kind of got the energy of that kind of citrus feeling, but without it being overwhelming. Or here in this space here, we've got little pops of the orange, just in some cushions, or maybe like, on the ceiling, but it's not overly dominating the space. Or here we've got like a sensual glow that captures the orange, but it's not, again, dominating the space. So another really important way to sort of think about colour, and we've seen that in, sort of in Kay and Magda's presentations as well, is about how colour can actually, apart from, creating some beautiful environments, it can also do a great job as well in sort of wayfinding and zoning. So you could, apply some of the principles that I've mentioned in my colour palettes, but actually kind of use those kind of, sensitive colour applications, but within areas. So here, I've picked a really beautiful sort of feel-good blue, but it's just kind of, filling up a small area of the space. So somebody could choose whether they wanted to sort of be in that space or not be in that space, but it kind of lifts the room and, adds this sort of pop of vibrancy. Or maybe, the space here, you can see this is quite a dry office environment. But here the colours used to kind of lift the area, little pops of blue and green. Suddenly, like, the space feels a lot more desirable to sit in, but it's not overpowering and dominating. Or here, like just zoning. So we've got these cool steps in the corner which lift the space, make it feel a lot more vibrant, more creative, but it's not sort of dominating. Or here, obviously, with the wayfinding, as Magda mentioned, it's quite a key way to use colour. It immediately kind of creates a lot more sort of inviting way to sort of lift the space and make it a lot more fun and enjoyable to be in.
So Jane, in the discussion of color, this idea of comfort comes up a lot. And, one of the reasons that Ultrafabrics has been interested in this topic is because we often think of ourselves in the business of comfort, what we do and how we do it. So I see there's a clear relationship between color and comfort and what we all do. And what I'm interested in is that in your presentation, you talked about color actually helping to create somewhat of a relaxed state, which certainly could be very helpful when we talk about neurodivergency. But what it made me think about was whether the goal of the environment is to create a relaxed state. I mean, in a workplace, you might be looking to create inspiration or creativity, right? It may not just be about creating something that's comfortable or relaxed. So I'm curious how we can use color to support goals of the business or the hotel or the hospital, whatever it may be, to create something beyond just comfort, but really deliver against the experiential goal of the building itself.
I think, that's a really, interesting point. Basically, if you go into a space and you've got a really beautiful color palette around you, you immediately feel good. It makes you feel like you want to spend time in the space. It makes you feel creative. For me, if I go into a space that's beautifully created with color, I feel really excited. It makes me happy. It makes me want to, it could initiate ideas. So I think it's about kind of using color in a really sort of careful way to sort of to give people the sort of the stimulation to become creative, but without overstimulating. So for me, the first slide that I showed you, which was very sort of powerful with the color, little bit like if you went into like a gym, you might have that environment. For me personally, I would not be able to work in a space like that. It would be too much for me. I wouldn't be able to sort of think beyond it. But I think also it's about tapping into trend as well. Obviously, a lot of my job is about trend. It's about finding what's everyone into, what are the trends which are coming through. If I go into a restaurant which has got the newest colours on display, a peach fuzz restaurant, for example, I would be very excited. I would feel, this space would make me feel good, make me feel happy. So I think it's about sort of carefully considering, the kinds of colours you're choosing, the kind of space that you're wanting people to spend time in. And it definitely for sure can make people come up with ideas and be happy and joyful and, work together to create great business.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jane. That was wonderful. Really appreciate your thoughts. So just a couple questions for the group that I think might add some interesting color to the conversation. What do you think are some sensory sensitive quick wins that designers can build into their practices, given the things that we're discussing now? Many of the topics we've talked about seem to require, a lot of thought and thinking, which of course is necessary, but are there any quick wins that a design team can think about in the context of our conversation today?
I think it's about what I call the sensory curation of space. So to make sure you invest time and square footage into creating like a sensory infrastructure that as people move through spaces, there are moments and opportunities for them to transition between experiences. And even within a singular space, to create a flexibility and choice and variety and gradient of all sorts of different sensory experiences. So you try and capture, even within the smallest spaces of a classroom or a meeting room or an office pool, that sensory seeking, sensory avoiding opportunity that people can independently navigate between.
From my point of view, it would just be considering low saturation color. Like color it's not of a high saturation. So, if you're choosing a blue or yellow, whatever color it is, just keeping like the saturation quite low. That would be my sort of way to go, being quite general.
So from all of our research, I think we've identified a whole series of things that people can do. But if you're looking for some quick wins, we've kind of identified some of the top things that are the most important for individuals. One of them is giving people options, choices, and a variety so they can kind of navigate to a space that might be better suited for them. Access to natural daylight, biophilic elements, letting people sit away from busy spaces, maybe in quiet zones, and even encouraging individuals to have access to spaces where they might be able to stand, move, or fidget can all be things that can help people today in existing spaces.
We've talked a lot about the importance of this idea of neurodiversity and being neuroinclusive. And although it's gaining steam and the attention towards it is growing in popularity and importance, it would seem to me that not all clients or companies that are hiring for design work really have this in mind. So do you think that there's a business case you could begin to make when working on a project that someone might be forced to consider? And if so, what are some of the things you might bring into the conversation at that point?
So one would like to believe that the good intentions of clients would be sufficient for them to invest the time and money that it takes to make neuroinclusive spaces, whether or not spaces are intentionally earmarked to be neuroinclusive. And I think that's the first step to avoid this idea. This is an autism-friendly X. I think all of our spaces need to have this neuroinclusivity in mind. But in absence of that good intention or the business case of that good intention, I think data is really important. So research that supports the impact of these neuroinclusive spaces on performance indicators of not only the neurodivergent population, but also the general population. And I think that's really important and something that everyone can get behind without it necessarily being a lens of autism or neurodiversity, but a lesson that we've learned from designing for that population that has benefits for all of the population.
So we're always going to argue that it costs just as much money to design something poorly as it does to design something well. And if you think about what the cost is to replace an employee for someone who you aren't accommodating, it will far exceed the cost of making some of the ramifications or adjustments or modifications that people might be seeking. And as far as the business case goes, we know that teams that are more diverse tend to be more successful. People that are neurodivergent tend to bring a whole different set of skills, whether it's a super focus or thinking outside of the box, not getting into groupthink, innovation, creativity, that are all good for business today.
Right. Great. Thank you. And so, Jane, final question. You know, the business of color is evolving, right? It's always changing. And I think there are cultural trends that are moving it forward and requiring you to stay on top of all those things. And the idea of neuroinclusivity is clearly a new important thing that, you know, is happening. So where do you see sort of this going in the world of color and the next evolution of this? And, you know, how do you think designers need to start thinking about color maybe a little differently as a result of this conversation?
You know, we're looking very much at color now as a tool for well-being. You know, the emotional effects of color, how color makes us feel, the clothes that we wear, the environment we're in, you know, whatever sort of experience we're having, how color affects us. We're getting, in the world of color, we're almost going deeper and deeper into the details of that. So I think this actually becomes, you know, an important topic in general, but also becomes something which is also going to inspire trends as well. And really, I can really see this growing and evolving and becoming, you know, a really big part of the whole world of color.
Great. Thanks, everybody. That was terrific. I hope that we learned a lot today. I know I certainly did. I think one of the most important topics that came up today was in Kay's presentation, where she talked about neurodivergent individuals being the canary in a coal mine. And what I think was so significant about that was that this is about not necessarily designing for a cohort or a unique group of individuals. This is about designing for everyone. This is about how this very important trend affects design and how we think about the built environment for an individual group that is becoming so important to us as designers, as individuals, but enables us to really think about the movement of design universally and how we have to consider environments differently, especially when we take into consideration color or the space itself or lighting. We now have tools to use. We now have guidance and books being written and all types of thought leaders that have clearly contributed to this discussion. And that's happening for a reason. It's happening because this topic is increasingly important and going to be so important relative to the work that you're doing and also winning new projects. A representation of this type of understanding clearly can lead to new business opportunities, because you're demonstrating that there is a bigger understanding needed to clearly create a space that speaks to individual needs. So we at Ultrafabrics have also been doing a lot of thinking around this topic as well, and we've created a white paper that you're welcome to download. That white paper can be found on our homepage, on our website. And if you go to ultrafabrics.com, right on our homepage, you can find our white paper, which is called Design for Neurodivergent People. And we hope that that can help you further understand this topic. And we welcome you to download it at any time and visit the site itself and the various things that we have to offer. But most importantly, we really appreciate you attending today. I wanted to thank you for your contribution to this, your participation, and I sincerely hope this was of value to you. So thank you so much.